March 1945, Western Germany. Two commanders faced the same river. One saw mathematics, the other saw destiny. Only one would be proven right. March 1945, Western Germany. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery had been planning Operation Plunder for months. It was to be the most elaborate river crossing in modern military history. A massive, meticulously coordinated assault across the Rhine River that would demonstrate British military professionalism and erase the humiliation of Market Garden's failure at Arnhem. The scope of Operation Plunder was unprecedented. Over 250,000 British, Canadian, and American troops would participate. More than 3,000 artillery guns had been positioned along the western bank of the Rhine, ready to deliver a crushing preparatory bombardment that would last for hours. Thousands of assault boats had been assembled and staged for rapid deployment. Two entire airborne divisions, British and American, would drop behind German lines to secure key positions and prevent reinforcements from reaching the crossing sites. Montgomery had calculated every detail. Supply depots had been established with surgical precision, ammunition stockpiled by the ton, fuel reserves calculated to the gallon, medical facilities prepared for every conceivable casualty scenario. Engineers had measured the river bottom at multiple crossing points, determining optimal locations for pontoon bridge construction down to the inch. Intelligence officers had analyzed German defensive positions and created detailed maps showing every machine gun nest, every artillery battery, every concentration of enemy troops. The operation's timeline was fixed with absolute precision. The artillery bombardment would begin at exactly 2100 hours on March 23rd. Infantry assault waves would launch at predetermined intervals throughout the night. Engineers would begin bridge construction in coordinated phases. By dawn on March 24th, armor would be rolling across into the heart of Germany. This was military planning at its finest. The kind of methodical, comprehensive approach that Montgomery believed represented proper warfare. This was how wars should be won. With careful preparation, overwhelming force, and risks reduced to near zero. Montgomery had even invited Prime Minister Winston Churchill to attend and witness the operation personally. Churchill had accepted with enthusiasm. Montgomery promised him Operation Plunder would be the crowning achievement of the European war, the decisive blow that would shatter Germany's last natural defensive barrier and open the path to final victory. For Montgomery, Operation Plunder was more than just a river crossing. It was vindication. After Market Garden's catastrophic failure in September 1944, when his ambitious plan to seize bridges across the Rhine had ended in disaster at Arnhem, with British paratroopers surrounded and destroyed, Montgomery needed a clear, unambiguous success. Operation Plunder would provide that success. It would prove that British forces, properly led and properly supplied, could deliver the war's defining moment. Montgomery's confidence was absolute. He had the men, he had the firepower, he had the plan. What he didn't know was that 200 kilometers to the south, another general was standing on the banks of the same river and seeing something entirely different. To understand how one unplanned crossing in darkness could overshadow months of preparation, you have to understand the Rhine itself and why it had haunted military planners for centuries. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. To understand how one unplanned crossing in darkness could overshadow months of preparation, you have to understand the Rhine itself and why it had haunted military planners for centuries. But more importantly, you have to understand the two men who stood on opposite sides of a philosophical divide as wide as the river itself. Bernard Law Montgomery did not believe in improvisation. To Montgomery, war was a science, complex, yes, but ultimately predictable if approached with sufficient rigor and discipline. Every battle was a problem to be solved through careful analysis, meticulous planning, and overwhelming preparation. Risk was something to be eliminated, not embraced. Uncertainty was the enemy, not the opponent across the battlefield. This wasn't caution, it was conviction. Montgomery had learned his lessons in the blood-soaked trenches of World War I, where he'd watched entire generations of British soldiers thrown against German machine guns in futile, poorly planned offensives. He'd seen what happened when generals gambled with men's lives. He'd witnessed the catastrophic cost of optimism untempered by preparation. Never again. Montgomery's command philosophy was built on iron principles. Before any offensive, intelligence had to be comprehensive. Supply lines had to be secure. Artillery superiority had to be overwhelming. Infantry had to be properly supported. Timing had to be precise. Nothing, absolutely nothing, should be left to chance. To Montgomery, this wasn't just military doctrine. It was moral responsibility. A general who risked his men unnecessarily was worse than incompetent. He was morally bankrupt. The British Army wasn't a tool for theatrical gestures or personal glory. It was composed of real men with families waiting for them at home. Every soldier's life mattered. Every casualty had to be justified by necessity, not ambition. Montgomery believed that professionalism, cold, methodical, unglamorous professionalism, was the highest virtue a military commander could possess. Set-piece battles were his specialty. Defensive positions carefully analyzed. Attack routes precisely calculated. Artillery barrages timed to the second. Infantry advances coordinated with armor support. Everything rehearsed, war-gamed, and executed according to plan. It had worked at El Alamein in 1942, where Montgomery's methodical approach had finally stopped Rommel's Afrika Korps after years of British defeats in the desert. It had worked in Normandy, where careful preparation had secured the beachhead. It had worked again and again when Montgomery refused to be rushed, refused to take unnecessary risks, refused to gamble. This was the right way to fight a war. And then there was George Patton, 200 kilometers south, standing on the Rhine's western bank. Patton saw the same river through entirely different eyes. To Patton, war was not science. It was art. Violent, chaotic, beautiful in its terrible way. War rewarded boldness, punished hesitation, and belonged to those willing to seize fleeting opportunities before they vanished. Planning mattered, yes. But planning was merely preparation for the moment when plans became irrelevant and instinct took over. Patton believed in speed, relentless, disorienting, overwhelming speed. Strike before the enemy can prepare, move before they can react, exploit confusion before they can recover, keep them off balance, keep them retreating, never give them time to think or reorganize or establish defensive positions. Where Montgomery saw risk to be minimized, Patton saw momentum to be maximized. Patton's philosophy was forged not in trenches, but in cavalry charges. The old American frontier spirit translated into mechanized warfare. He'd studied ancient commanders, Alexander, Hannibal, Napoleon. Men who understood that battles were won not by eliminating uncertainty, but by creating it for the enemy. Men who knew that the perfect plan executed tomorrow was worthless compared to the adequate plan executed today. To Patton, hesitation was the only unforgivable sin. Every day spent planning was a day the enemy spent preparing. Every hour lost to caution was an opportunity that would never return. The German army wasn't getting weaker while you planned. They were digging in, reinforcing, adapting. The only way to win was to hit them faster than they could respond. Patton had proven it in Sicily in 1943, when his 7th Army raced across the island while other Allied forces moved cautiously. He'd proven it again in France in 1944, when his 3rd Army's lightning advance across the country had captured more ground and more prisoners than any other Allied force. He'd proven it at Bastogne that winter, when told it was impossible to relieve the surrounded garrison in time, and did it anyway. Speed, aggression, momentum. This was how wars were actually won. 2 philosophies, 2 men, both absolutely convinced they were right, and both carrying the weight of a rivalry that had poisoned Allied command for 2 years. It had started in Sicily. Montgomery had been given overall ground command for the invasion of the island in July 1943. Patton's 7th Army was assigned a supporting role, protecting Montgomery's flank while the British 8th Army drove north toward Messina, Sicily's strategic prize. Patton had chafed at the subordinate role from the beginning. When Montgomery's advance stalled in the face of German resistance, Patton saw his opening. He launched his own drive toward Messina, racing Montgomery to the objective in what became an undignified competition between supposed allies. Patton won. His forces entered Messina first. Montgomery never forgave him. To Montgomery, Patton's actions in Sicily represented everything wrong with American military culture. Theatrical, undisciplined, more concerned with headlines than with professional military conduct. Patton had turned a carefully coordinated campaign into a personal publicity stunt. To Patton, Montgomery's criticism represented everything wrong with British military culture. Hidebound, inflexible, more concerned with procedure than with results. Montgomery had moved too slowly and then complained when someone else moved faster. The rivalry only intensified in France. After D-Day, Montgomery had been designated overall ground forces commander. It was supposed to be temporary, a recognition of British experience and planning contributions. But as weeks turned to months and Montgomery's cautious advance toward Caen fell behind schedule, American commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Patton's breakout from Normandy in August 1944 made the contrast impossible to ignore. While Montgomery's forces were still fighting for Caen weeks after the invasion, Patton's 3rd Army was racing across France, liberating city after city, encircling German divisions, creating chaos in enemy rear areas. The American press celebrated Patton as a conquering hero. The British press defended Montgomery as a steady professional being undermined by reckless cowboys. Behind closed doors, the tension was far worse. Montgomery believed Patton was a dangerous maverick whose recklessness would eventually lead to catastrophe. Patton believed Montgomery was an overcautious plotter whose timidity was prolonging the war and costing lives. Both men complained to Eisenhower. Both men questioned the other's competence. Both men made clear they believed they should be given priority for supplies, reinforcements, and operational authority. But this wasn't just personal animosity between 2 difficult personalities. It was cultural friction between 2 nations. The British Army had fought since 1939. It had endured Dunkirk's humiliation, survived the Blitz, fought across North Africa and Italy. Britain was exhausted, economically drained, militarily stretched to its limit, dependent on American industrial might to continue the war. British commanders like Montgomery carried the weight of that exhaustion. They couldn't afford reckless casualties. They couldn't replace divisions easily. Every loss mattered in ways American commanders, backed by seemingly infinite industrial capacity, might not fully appreciate. The American Army, by contrast, had arrived late to the European war but brought overwhelming material advantage. American commanders could afford to be aggressive because they had the industrial base to absorb losses, replace equipment, and sustain high-tempo operations indefinitely. Coalition politics magnified every disagreement. When Montgomery criticized American tactics, it sounded like condescension from an empire in decline trying to lecture its successor. When American commanders criticized British caution, it sounded like arrogance from newcomers who hadn't yet learned war's terrible cost. Eisenhower found himself constantly mediating between two allies who were supposed to be fighting the same enemy. Montgomery demanded that all Allied resources be concentrated for a single, massive thrust into Germany under British command. Patton insisted that American forces be given freedom to exploit opportunities as they arose. Montgomery wanted centralized control and coordinated operations. Patton wanted decentralized initiative and aggressive pursuit. Neither man was wrong, exactly. Montgomery's caution had prevented disasters. His methodical approach had secured objectives that hasty attacks might have squandered. His insistence on proper preparation had saved countless lives. Patton's aggression had shortened campaigns. His willingness to exploit opportunities had prevented German forces from establishing stable defensive lines. His momentum had kept the enemy perpetually off balance. Both approaches worked. Both had proven themselves in battle. Both commanders had achieved victories that justified their methods. But they were fundamentally incompatible. And now, in March 1945, both men faced the Rhine, Germany's last great natural barrier, with their competing philosophies on full display. Montgomery with his massive, meticulously planned Operation Plunder. Patton with his eyes on a lightly defended crossing site and a fleeting window of opportunity. The Rhine would not just test German defenses. It would decide which philosophy would define victory. Montgomery's plan for Operation Plunder wasn't just comprehensive. It was a masterpiece of military engineering. The operation would begin at precisely 2100 hours on March 23rd with the largest artillery bombardment since D-Day. Over 3,000 guns positioned along the Rhine's western bank would fire a coordinated barrage designed to obliterate German defensive positions across a 25-mile front. The shelling would continue for hours, systematically destroying bunkers, communication lines, and supply depots. At 2130 hours, the first wave of assault boats would launch. British and Canadian infantry would cross at multiple points simultaneously, establishing beachheads on the eastern bank, while German defenders were still reeling from the bombardment. By midnight, engineers would begin constructing pontoon bridges at pre-surveyed locations. Materials had been prefabricated and staged. Steel panels, cable anchors, flotation sections, all numbered and organized for rapid assembly. Each bridge team knew exactly what to build, where to build it, and how long it should take. At dawn on March 24th, 2 airborne divisions would drop behind German lines. American and British paratroopers would seize key road junctions, cut off German reinforcement routes, and create chaos in the enemy rear areas. Unlike Market Garden's doomed airborne operation, these drops would be coordinated with ground forces already across the river. Once the bridges were complete, armor would cross. Thousands of tanks and vehicles would pour into Germany, exploiting the bridgeheads faster than German forces could respond. It was warfare as engineering problem. Variables identified, risks calculated, solutions implemented. Montgomery had even choreographed the symbolism. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would be there to witness the crossing. The old lion himself, watching British forces deliver the decisive blow of the European war. Photographers would document the moment. Historians would record it for posterity. This wasn't just military necessity, it was theater. Britain's final vindication after 6 years of grinding warfare. For Montgomery, Everything rode on Operation Plunder's success. His reputation, certainly. Market Garden's failure still haunted him. The overambitious plan, the isolated paratroopers at Arnhem, the humiliating withdrawal. One more failure would end his career, possibly tarnish his legacy forever. But also Britain's standing in the alliance. American forces had captured the headlines throughout 1944 and early 1945. Operation Plunder would remind the world that British military professionalism still mattered. That experience and discipline still counted for something. Montgomery had staked everything on perfect execution. Every unit had rehearsed their roles, every commander understood the timeline, every piece of equipment had been inspected and positioned. Intelligence had been analyzed and reanalyzed. Weather forecasts had been studied. Contingency plans had been drafted for every conceivable problem. Nothing had been overlooked. Nothing had been rushed. Nothing had been left to chance. Montgomery believed nothing could go wrong. He had eliminated uncertainty, or so he thought. 200 kilometers south in 3rd Army headquarters, George Patton was reading intelligence reports that changed everything. The German defenders at Oppenheim were weak, critically weak. The 5th Infantry Division's reconnaissance patrols had been probing the Rhine's eastern bank for days, testing German responses, mapping defensive positions. What they discovered was stunning. The sector across from Oppenheim was held by exhausted, understrength units with minimal artillery support and almost no reserves. The Germans had concentrated their forces further north, expecting Montgomery's massive assault. They'd left Oppenheim virtually undefended. Patton stared at the reports, his mind racing through possibilities. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. A chance to cross the Rhine with minimal opposition, establish a bridgehead before the Germans could react, and prove that speed could achieve what months of preparation promised. But there was a problem. Operation Plunder was scheduled for March 23rd, the next day. Allied command expected all Rhine crossings to be coordinated. Montgomery's operation was the main effort. Everything else was supposed to wait, to avoid diverting resources or attention from the British-Canadian assault. Crossing at Oppenheim now would violate that coordination. It would mean acting without authorization from Supreme Headquarters. It would undermine the carefully constructed Allied plan. Patton's staff made the objections clear. "Sir, we don't have approval from Reshape," his chief of staff warned. "This isn't part of the operational plan." "The logistics aren't in place for a major crossing," another officer added. "We'd be improvising everything." "If we fail, it could compromise Montgomery's operation," a third cautioned. Patton listened. He understood their concerns. They were all valid according to doctrine and procedure. But doctrine didn't win wars. Opportunity did. Patton's reasoning was brutally simple. If they waited for approval, the opportunity would vanish. The Germans would reinforce Oppenheim. The window would close. They'd be forced to attempt a heavily contested crossing later, at far greater cost. Every hour they hesitated was an hour the enemy used to prepare. Speed wasn't just advantageous. It was everything. Patton had built his entire career on this principle. Strike when the enemy is weak, not when you're perfectly ready. Exploit confusion before it hardens into prepared defense. Move fast enough that permission becomes irrelevant, because by the time anyone objects, you've already won. Besides, what would headquarters do if he succeeded? Court-martial the general who'd breached Germany's last great barrier ahead of schedule? "Get the 5th Infantry Division ready," Patton ordered. "Canvas boats, night crossing, no artillery preparation. We go in silent." His staff exchanged glances. This was really happening. "Sir," his chief of staff said carefully, Shafe will congratulate us when we're on the other side. Patton cut him off. Get it done. The decision was made. Patton understood exactly what he was risking. His career, certainly. Allied coordination, possibly. Court-martial, maybe, if it went wrong. But he also understood something his critics never seemed to grasp. Opportunities in war don't wait for permission. They appear for a moment and then vanish forever. The only unforgivable mistake was seeing that moment and letting it pass. On the night of March 22, 1945, George Patton crossed a line before crossing the river. The night of March 22nd was moonless and cold. At 2200 hours, soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division carried canvas assault boats down to the Rhine's western bank. No searchlights, no engines, no radio chatter. Just the soft scrape of boots on mud and the quiet splash of boats entering the current. The darkness was total. Across the river, German positions sat silent. No flares went up. No machine guns opened fire. The defenders, exhausted, depleted, convinced the main American assault would come elsewhere, suspected nothing. The first boats slipped into the water, 12 men per boat, paddling quietly, letting the current help carry them across. The Rhine was wide here, nearly 300 yards, but the water was relatively calm. Soldiers gripped their rifles, scanning the opposite bank for any sign of alarm. Nothing. The boats reached the eastern shore. American soldiers stepped onto German soil, weapons ready, expecting resistance. Still nothing. Within minutes, an entire company was across. Then a battalion, then more. The crossing became steady, silent flow of men and equipment moving from west to east under cover of darkness. When German sentries finally noticed something was wrong, it was far too late. Scattered shots rang out, confused, uncoordinated. A few German soldiers tried to organize resistance, but they were isolated, outnumbered, and had no idea how many Americans were already across. Some fought. Most retreated. Many simply surrendered, too shocked and exhausted to resist. By midnight, the 5th Infantry Division held a solid bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank. American engineers immediately went to work. Pontoon bridge sections, pre-assembled and staged on the western bank, were brought forward. Teams worked with desperate speed, anchoring flotation sections, laying roadway panels, connecting segments into a continuous span. They expected German artillery to target the construction. They expected counterattacks to try to collapse the bridgehead. Neither materialized. The German forces in the sector were simply too weak, too disorganized, and too surprised to mount effective resistance. The Americans had achieved complete tactical surprise. By 0400 hours, the first pontoon bridge was operational. Vehicles began crossing. Trucks, artillery pieces, supplies. A second bridge was completed an hour later. As dawn broke on March 23rd, the impossible had become reality. American forces held positions 2 miles deep on the Rhine's eastern bank. 2 bridges were operational and reinforcements were pouring across. German defenders were in full retreat. The bridgehead was secure. Casualty reports came in throughout the morning. The numbers were almost unbelievable. Fewer than 40 Americans killed or wounded in the entire operation. The Rhine, Germany's legendary defensive barrier, the river that had protected German territory for centuries, the obstacle every Allied planner had feared, had been breached in a single night with minimal loss. Soldiers on both banks stood in stunned disbelief. They'd done it. They'd crossed the Rhine ahead of schedule, ahead of authorization, ahead of everyone. Doctrine said river crossings required massive artillery preparation, overwhelming force, and meticulous coordination. Patton had just proved doctrine wrong. The barrier that was supposed to hold for weeks had fallen in hours. Everything the Allied command believed about the Rhine, its width, its current, its defensive strength, had been shattered by one unauthorized night crossing and 1,200 men in canvas boats. By morning, Germany's last great defense was behind them. But Patton's greatest battle was just beginning. Patton understood something that Montgomery never fully grasped. Winning the battle was only half the victory. Controlling the narrative was the other half. By mid-morning on March 23rd, Patton was pressuring Supreme Headquarters to release news of Third Army's Rhine crossing. He knew exactly what he was doing. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin that evening, less than 12 hours away. If the news broke now, Patton's crossing would dominate the headlines before Montgomery's massive operation even started. SHAEF headquarters initially resisted. Releasing the information early could compromise operational security. It could undermine Montgomery's carefully planned assault. It could create diplomatic friction within the alliance. But Patton had facts on his side. The crossing was complete, the bridgehead was secure, and the Germans already knew about it. There was no security reason to delay the announcement. The only reason to wait was politics. And Patton knew that Allied headquarters, despite their frustrations with his unauthorized action, couldn't suppress a major military success. The news was released that afternoon. Patton's Third Army crosses the Rhine. The headlines exploded across American and British newspapers. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming to announce that American forces had breached Germany's last great natural barrier ahead of schedule, with minimal casualties in a daring night operation. The public reaction was euphoric. After months of grinding warfare, here was a clear, dramatic victory, achieved with speed, surprise, and American boldness. At Allied headquarters, the reaction was considerably less enthusiastic. Staff officers who'd spent months coordinating Operation Plunder's logistics watched in dismay as Patton's unauthorized crossing became the story of the day. Eisenhower's headquarters fielded urgent communications from Montgomery's command demanding explanations. At Montgomery's headquarters, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Montgomery was making final preparations for Operation Plunder, reviewing timelines, coordinating with Churchill's arrival, ensuring every detail was perfect for the operation that would define the war's final chapter. And then he learned that Patton had already crossed. In public, Montgomery was carefully dismissive. He described Third Army's crossing as a minor operation compared to the scale of Operation Plunder. He noted that Patton had crossed at a lightly defended sector, whereas British forces would assault heavily fortified positions. He emphasized that proper military operations required coordination and preparation, not improvisation. "Very American," he remarked to his staff, the condescension unmistakable. But privately, Montgomery was furious. Months of planning, thousands of troops positioned, artillery pre-registered, airborne divisions ready to jump. Churchill scheduled to witness Britain's crowning military achievement of the war. All of it now overshadowed by Patton's unauthorized night crossing. The press would compare them. The public would judge them. Montgomery's methodical professionalism would inevitably be contrasted with Patton's dashing audacity. And Montgomery knew which narrative would capture the public imagination. This wasn't about military effectiveness. Operation Plunder would succeed exactly as planned. The British and Canadian forces would cross the Rhine with overwhelming force and establish secure bridgeheads. But the moment was gone. The historic significance, the dramatic impact, the vindication Montgomery desperately needed after Market Garden's failure. Patton had stolen all of it. Montgomery paced his headquarters, the anger building. This wasn't just about ego or publicity. This was about discipline, about coordination, about proper military conduct. Patton had violated the operational plan. He'd acted without authorization. He'd undermined alliance unity for personal glory. It couldn't stand. Montgomery had lost the moment, and he knew exactly who to blame. On March 24th, as Operation Plunder unfolded exactly as planned, Montgomery drafted a formal communication to Supreme Headquarters. It was not a complaint. It was not a protest. It was a carefully reasoned military recommendation, backed by principles that transcended personal rivalry. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. should be relieved of command. Montgomery's argument was precise and uncompromising. Patton had violated the established operational plan. He had crossed the Rhine without authorization from Supreme Headquarters. He had acted independently in a coalition operation that required coordination. He had undermined months of careful planning by prioritizing personal initiative over alliance unity. This wasn't about the operation's success, Montgomery emphasized. Third Army's crossing had indeed succeeded. But success obtained through insubordination was more dangerous than honorable failure. If Allied commanders were permitted to ignore operational plans and act unilaterally whenever they saw an opportunity, coalition warfare would collapse into chaos. The carefully constructed command structure, British and American forces operating under unified direction, would become meaningless. Discipline had to matter more than results. Montgomery framed his recommendation in terms that went far beyond personal grievances. This was about precedent, about command authority, about the fundamental question of whether generals in a coalition could simply disregard orders when they disagreed with them. If Patton's action went unpunished, what message did that send? That aggressive commanders could ignore directives with impunity as long as they succeeded? That coordination was optional? That individual judgment superseded alliance planning? The implications terrified Montgomery. He'd spent the entire war managing the delicate balance between British and American forces, trying to maintain professional standards while accommodating different military cultures. Patton's Rhine crossing threatened to destroy that balance entirely. Montgomery made clear this wasn't personal animosity. He acknowledged Patton's tactical abilities. He recognized Third Army's achievements. But military competence didn't excuse insubordination. The formal recommendation reached Eisenhower's desk on March 25th. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower read it with growing dread. This was the crisis he'd been trying to avoid for 2 years. The moment when personal rivalries, cultural tensions, and competing military philosophies finally forced an impossible choice. Montgomery wasn't wrong. Patton had violated orders. He'd acted unilaterally in a coalition operation. He'd undermined the careful coordination that held the alliance together. But Patton wasn't wrong either. He'd seized an opportunity that would have vanished if he'd waited for authorization. He'd breached Germany's last Great Barrier ahead of schedule with minimal casualties. He'd proven that aggressive action could achieve what careful planning promised. Eisenhower understood the stakes. Relieving Patton would satisfy discipline and mollify Montgomery. It would send a clear message about command authority and coalition coordination. But it would also remove one of the most effective combat commanders in the Allied Army at the war's critical final phase. Keeping Patton would preserve Third Army's momentum and American morale. It would validate aggressive initiative. But it would infuriate Montgomery, possibly damage British-American relations, and suggest that success excused insubordination. There was no good option. The communication sat on Eisenhower's desk, waiting for a response. Montgomery expected an answer. Patton's fate hung in the balance. The entire Allied command structure watched to see which principle would prevail. Discipline or results, coordination or initiative, order or opportunity. One signature could end Patton's career. Eisenhower now had to choose. Dwight D. Eisenhower had spent the entire war mediating between allies who were supposed to be fighting the same enemy. Now he faced the decision that would define his command. The arguments for relieving Patton were compelling. Montgomery was right about discipline. Coalition warfare required coordination. If every general acted independently whenever they disagreed with operational plans, the alliance would fracture. Orders had to mean something. Command authority had to be respected. Patton had violated those principles, deliberately, unapologetically. But Eisenhower also understood the arguments against relief. The war was in its final phase. German resistance was collapsing, but not yet broken. The Wehrmacht still had divisions in the field, still controlled territory, still could mount defensive operations. Speed mattered now more than ever. Momentum could end the war weeks or even months earlier. And Patton was momentum personified. Third Army had proven itself the most aggressive, most effective exploitation force in the Allied Army. Patton's ability to maintain relentless pressure, to prevent German forces from establishing defensive lines, to keep the enemy perpetually retreating, that was irreplaceable. Relieving Patton now would slow Third Army's advance. It would demoralize American troops who idolized their commander. It would send a message that cautious procedure mattered more than battlefield success. Eisenhower weighed the political dimensions carefully. Montgomery represented British military prestige and alliance credibility. Ignoring his formal recommendation could damage the coalition, undermine British confidence in American leadership, and create lasting diplomatic friction. But American public opinion and American military morale strongly supported Patton. Relieving the general who'd just dramatically breached the Rhine would appear to be punishing success, subordinating American interests to British sensibilities. There was no perfect answer. Eisenhower made his decision based on a brutal calculation. Results mattered more than procedure when the war hung in the balance. Patton would not be relieved. The response to Montgomery was carefully crafted. Eisenhower acknowledged that Patton's action had violated coordination protocols. He agreed that such independence couldn't become standard practice. He assured Montgomery that the incident would be addressed internally. But he also emphasized that removing Third Army's commander at this critical moment would undermine Allied momentum when speed was essential to ending the war quickly. Patton would stay. Montgomery received Eisenhower's response with barely contained fury. The message was clear. Success excused insubordination. American commanders could act unilaterally without consequence. All Montgomery's arguments about discipline and coalition order had been dismissed. He had lost. Patton, informed privately of Eisenhower's decision, understood exactly what it meant. He'd gambled his career on a night crossing and won everything. His philosophy had been vindicated. Aggressive initiative had proven more valuable than methodical coordination. The decision rippled through Allied command. British officers saw confirmation of their worst suspicions about American military culture. Theatrical, undisciplined, more concerned with headlines than professionalism. American officers saw validation of their belief that results mattered more than procedure. But Eisenhower understood something both camps missed. He hadn't chosen between Montgomery and Patton. He'd chosen between principles that were both valid in different contexts. Discipline mattered. Coordination mattered. But at this specific moment in this specific war, momentum mattered more. The war would end sooner because Patton stayed in command. German forces would have less time to prepare defenses, less opportunity to prolong resistance. Allied casualties would be lower because the fighting would end faster. That calculation, cold, pragmatic, focused entirely on ending the war, determined Eisenhower's choice. The decision was made, and history would never forget it. On March 24th, George Patton crossed the Rhine himself. He walked out to the middle of the pontoon bridge his engineers had constructed, stopped halfway across, and deliberately urinated into the river. It was crude, unprofessional, theatrical in the worst possible way, and absolutely unforgettable. To the soldiers who witnessed it, and to the thousands who heard about it within hours, the gesture symbolized everything they felt. The enemy was beaten. The barrier was broken. The war's end was inevitable. Germany's legendary defensive river had been reduced to just another obstacle overcome. The story spread through Third Army like wildfire, then through the entire Allied force. Patton had literally pissed on Hitler's last great defense. It became instant legend, the kind of story soldiers would tell for decades. To Montgomery, hearing about it later, the act confirmed everything he despised about Patton. Undignified, attention-seeking, contemptuous of professional military conduct. But history was already choosing its narrative. Operation Plunder succeeded exactly as Montgomery planned. British and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine with overwhelming force, established secure bridgeheads, and advanced into Germany with methodical precision. The operation achieved every objective. Casualties were minimized through careful preparation. It was a textbook example of proper military planning. Yet Operation Plunder would forever live in Patton's shadow. The comparison was inevitable and merciless. Montgomery had spent months preparing a massive operation. Patton had crossed in a single night with canvas boats. Montgomery had mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops. Patton had breached the barrier with a single division. Montgomery had calculated every detail. Patton had improvised. Both succeeded, but only one captured the imagination. History tends to remember boldness over professionalism, audacity over preparation, the dramatic gesture over the methodical execution. It's unfair, perhaps, but it's reality. Montgomery had won the battle but lost the narrative. His careful planning had been proven effective, but not exciting. His professional competence had been demonstrated, but not celebrated. Patton had become legend. Yet the deeper truth was more complex than either man's philosophy suggested. The war wasn't won by Patton's audacity alone. Montgomery's methodical approach had been essential at El Alamein in Normandy, in countless operations where careful preparation prevented disaster. Discipline, coordination, and professionalism had held the alliance together through years of grinding warfare. And the war wasn't won by Montgomery's caution alone. Patton's aggressive exploitation had shortened campaigns, prevented German forces from establishing defensive lines, and maintained momentum when hesitation would have prolonged the conflict. Both approaches worked. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient by itself. The real triumph belonged to Eisenhower, the man who'd managed to harness both philosophies without letting either destroy the alliance. He'd given Montgomery the resources for set-piece operations, while allowing Patton the freedom to exploit opportunities. He'd maintained discipline while rewarding initiative. He'd balanced British caution with American aggression. Eisenhower understood what Montgomery and Patton never quite grasped. War is won not by choosing one philosophy over another, but by knowing when each philosophy serves the moment. The Rhine itself became a symbol of that balance. Montgomery had planned to conquer it through overwhelming preparation. Patton had seized it through audacious opportunity. Both crossed, Both succeeded. Both contributed to Germany's collapse. The river that had protected German territory for centuries, that had defeated armies throughout history, that had haunted Allied planners for months. It had finally fallen not to one approach or one commander, but to the combined weight of an alliance that could accommodate different methods toward the same end. Montgomery remained the architect, the professional, the methodical planner whose careful work made victory possible. Patton became the legend, the warrior, the audacious gambler whose boldness made victory dramatic. History needs both. It remembers one more vividly. Montgomery wanted Patton gone. Instead, Patton crossed into history and left the Rhine behind him.